Hello and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Inside Job, Women in Confucianism. When you think of classical Confucianism, many things may come to mind, but chances are that feminism is not one of them, which is not without good reason. As we've seen repeatedly, this was a school of thought that was deeply devoted to tradition, and as in other pre-modern cultures, traditional ideas about women in ancient China were hardly liberatory. These ideas were condensed into a pithy saying, "Man plows, woman weaves," indicating the gender division of tasks within society. Significantly, that proverb assigns to women a task to be carried out within the home, literally an inside job, while men worked outdoors. More generally, women were associated with the inside, or ne, while men were active in the outside, or wai. That included not just farming, but also, and for the Confucians crucially, the political sphere, from which women were, in theory at least, entirely excluded. Women were also expected to be reliant on their male relatives. As another saying had it, their lives were determined by a threefold dependence, san chong, with young girls dependent on their fathers, mature women on their husbands, and older women on their grown sons. In keeping with this, the social and political rank of a woman was nothing she could claim in her own right, but simply corresponded to that of the men in her family, especially her husband. We've seen in episode 16 that one of the Guojian Confucian texts, the Liu De, or the Six Virtues, uses the metaphor of gates to draw a line between different types of relationships. The Liu De says, internal positions are father, son, husband, external positions are ruler, minister, wife, and it sets up different norms that apply to what is internal and external to the gates. Even within a household of sufficient size, there were separate spaces for women and men. The Book of Rights describes the ideal situation as follows. The men occupied the exterior, wai, women the interior, ne. The men did not enter the interior, and women did not come out into the exterior. There was a ritual injunction against physical contact between women and men, which was taken so seriously that a man who needed to give an object to a woman might first put it into a basket to be passed to her. This explains a striking passage in the Mengzi, in which the question is raised whether it would be appropriate to touch one's sister-in-law in order to save her from drowning. Mengzi allows that in this case the exigent circumstances do permit one to use discretion, which illustrates that Confucianism could accommodate flexibility in response to particular circumstance, but he does not challenge the requirements of the ritual practice itself. He simply accepts that such an extreme situation would justify violating the practice. Such attitudes explain the intense interest taken by later commentators in an episode described in the Book of Odes, in which Kongzi presented himself to the powerful noblewoman Nanzi and prostrated himself before her. Even though he did so from behind a curtain and knew that she bowed back to him only because he could hear the clinking of her jade jewelry, this act displeased his student Zilu. Kongzi swore that the encounter had been in keeping with ritual propriety, adding that if this was not so, may heaven reject me. While these passages paint a picture of repression and restriction, we should bear in mind that, as in other spheres of life, like music and courtly decorum, accounts of ritual propriety in Confucian texts are better taken as moralistic aspiration than as historical reportage. In fact, we can find evidence of female agency going back to the earliest periods of Chinese history. This is especially true when it comes to the upper classes. Bronze inscriptions from the Zhou period testify to the influence of aristocratic women, who sometimes commissioned these works and are frequently mentioned in them. A degree of autonomy was also secured by the continued connection wives retained to their birth families, for instance through ritual practices and ancestral worship. While this meant that the wife was conceived as an outsider within her married family, it helped to justify remarriage, in that the wife was understood as never having fully left her own family. And, notwithstanding the strict regulations envisioned by texts like the Book of Rights, there is evidence that a small number of aristocratic women were able to move about freely in the Zhou period, the very time that was taken as the paradigm of appropriate custom by the Confucians. Particularly striking is the fact that women were evidently involved in the complex practices surrounding divination. We know that women sometimes prepared oracle bones and that divinatory ceremonies were carried out at their behest. Sometimes the Book of Changes, or I Ching, is read as conveying highly negative stereotypes of women, but these interpretations can be challenged, as with one hexagram that seems to advise against marrying a strong woman, but in fact probably just recommends avoiding the marriage despite her good physical condition. There's also some evidence that women participated in prognostication themselves. In the Zhou Chuan, we have the story of a noblewoman named Mu Jiang who was offered a favorable divination that predicted her escape after she was jailed following an attempted coup. She rejected the interpretation of the diviner, bitterly stating that her misdeeds had surely guaranteed her doom. Since I have chosen evil, how can there be no trouble for me? Admittedly, that same story illustrates the tendency of texts like the Zhou Chuan to lament the dire consequences that result when women interfere in the masculine world of politics. This same historical work describes a number of such meddling females, for instance the seductive and mischievous Jia Ji, about whom the historian writes, "She killed 3 husbands, 1 ruler and 1 son, and brought 1 domain and 2 high ministers to their destruction. How can you fail to learn a lesson from that? I have heard that great beauty always holds great evil." The Book of Odes makes the same point with admirable brevity, even if the sentiment is anything but admirable. A wise man builds a city, a wise woman ruins a city. But it's not as if the historical works are unremitting in their condemnation of women, even in the political sphere. We also find stories in which rulers get sage advice from their wives. Take, for instance, the Prince of Jin, whose wife, Ding Jiang, advised him not to refuse an audience to a powerful guest. "Even though you hate him, is it not better to bear his presence than to perish? My lord should endure this." Here, Ding Jiang teaches her husband a lesson in putting personal emotions aside for the sake of propriety, or just political expedience. One could imagine Xunzi nodding in approval, especially when she adds that a beneficial result of this forbearance will be bringing peace to the people. Such passages prefigure the admiring portraits we'll find in a text from the Han period that will feature in a later episode, the biographies of virtuous women. One of the virtuous women described in it is none other than the mother of Mengzi. Which brings us to our Confucian authors and the question of how they responded to this rather complex set of social expectations and attitudes. It's not a theme explored much in the Analects, and when women do come up in this work, the picture is not a favorable one. Most notorious are the lines, "Women and servants are particularly hard to manage. If you are too familiar with them, they grow insolent, but if you are too distant, they grow resentful." That sounds extremely dismissive, though a few points can be made by way of defusing the passage. First, it comes from the 17th book of the Analects, which is not thought to belong to the earliest core of the text that runs only down to the end of the 10th book. Secondly, and more importantly, the term used here for women can be more narrowly understood as girls or unmarried women, so that the passage may in fact simply concern female servants along with male servants, or perhaps concubines and servants. This would mean that Kongzi's remark is really one about class and not gender, making it no doubt just as objectionable from the modern point of view, but on different grounds. Another passage worth mentioning is one that touches on the difficulty of finding good political advisors and suggests that a small number of them will suffice. It reads as follows. "Shun had 5 ministers, and the world was well governed. King Wu said, 'I have 10 ministers in charge of establishing order.' The master commented, 'It is said that talent is difficult to find. Is it not the case? Virtue flourished as never before after the reigns of Yao and Shun, and yet, even among King Wu's 10 ministers, there was a woman included, so he really only had 9 good men.'" Again, this might look very dismissive at first glance, but at second glance we may find it remarkable that a woman is given a place among this select group, even if she is not counted as the sort of advisor a ruler would normally be looking for. This unnamed woman is, by the way, probably King Wu's mother, Tai Ren, praised in the Book of Odes as pure and reverent. Our sources become richer when we move on to the Mengzi and Xunzi. Both works lay great emphasis on the union of male and female. Mengzi, as so often speaking fondly of the good old days when harmony ruled the world, mentions that in those golden ages, there were neither girls pining for a husband nor men without a wife. Even in his own more chaotic time, it remains the case that as soon as children are born, their parents look forward to the day when they will marry. Xunzi explains why this is so important. His social political philosophy revolves around the idea of having an orderly society by making distinctions, including the distinction between man and woman or husband and wife. Thus he writes, "When the positions of lord and minister, father and son, older brother and younger brother, husband and wife, all begin and then end and then begin again, when they are part of the same order with heaven and earth and persist as long as the myriad generations, this is called the Great Root. Just as the comprehensive virtue known as benevolence begins in filial piety, so domestic life, the sphere of women, is the setting in which boys develop the traits that will be needed out in the world of men. Thus, Xunzi also remarks, the way of husband and wife must be correctly followed, for it is the root of relations between lord and minister, father and son. In keeping with this, both Confucian thinkers recognize the possibility and importance of virtue in women, as well as in men. Mengzi tells a couple of stories that get this point across. In one, a man's concubine and wife discover that he has been turning up at funerals as an uninvited guest in order to enjoy the food laid out by the grieving families. The women are mortified by this behavior, and Mengzi speaks of how they reviled the husband and they wept together in the courtyard. Especially striking here is that one of the two is the miscreant's concubine and thus a person of lower standing, as we can see from the fact that the sons of concubines could not inherit title from their fathers. No doubt we are meant to be impressed by the moral compass of this doubly humble person, which throws into sharp relief the devious character of the husband. In another tale, or rather a passing mention, Mengzi alludes to the women of Hua Zhou and Jielan, who were so good at weeping for their husbands that they changed the customs of the state. The allusion here is to women whose husbands were killed in warfare, and chastised the ruler for not offering condolences in an appropriate fashion. Mengzi adds that what happens inside will express itself in the outside. In other words, an act of virtue by a woman in the household can lead to improvements in governance. Along similar lines, Xunzi gives the following advice to wives: if your husband follows the dictates of ritual, then compliantly obey him and wait upon him attentively. If your husband does not follow the dictates of ritual, then be apprehensive, but keep yourself respectful. This indicates that the Xunzi is not promoting a crude gender-based hierarchy, but rather implying that the husband's authority should be deserved. Here it opens up two options for how a wife may respond to her husband. This choice in how to respond to people with higher standing should remind us of the Confucian advice to children who find that they need to correct their parents, or ministers who have to admonish the ruler. Such criticism is consistent with ritual propriety, but it should be delivered with utmost delicacy. So, in the opinion of these classical Confucians, women can be virtuous, even if they cannot attain the fullest grade of virtue. It's no coincidence that Yao Shun, the Duke of Zhou, and Kong Su himself were all men. Still, women play a decisive role in a well-functioning society, precisely because such a society depends on the maintenance of the appropriate relationship between men and women. And that relationship is not characterized only by obedience or submissiveness, even if that is certainly part of what the Confucians expect from daughters and wives. Tellingly, when Mengzi sets out the 5 key relationships within Confucian ethics, father-son, ruler-minister, husband-wife, elder-younger brother, and between friends, he says that the relationship between husband and wife should be one of distinction, by which he means that both should carry out their separate functions. So, the two genders are defined functionally in terms of the roles that women and men ought to play, not in terms of biological difference. It is still clearer in Xunzi that the male-female relationship depends on distinctions that are maintained by human action, and especially by good rulership and ritual. He claims that such distinctions are absent in the animal world, even though animals are biologically divided. They have the male sex and the female sex, but no differentiation between male and female. So, as modern scholar Xin Yi Chan rightly states, biological determinism is absent in the Confucian conception of gender. None of this is especially surprising, since it really just applies the Confucians' general account of propriety and social roles to the specific case of gender. But they were also giving voice to a more general tendency in ancient Chinese society. Think again about that saying, man plows, woman weaves. The cooperative division of labor it implied was, as any Ru scholar would have been able to tell you, represented in a ritual ceremony in which the emperor went through the motions of plowing while his wife symbolically tended to silkworms. Feel free to again imagine Xunzi nodding in approval. He might also point us to a relevant text in the treatise that bears his name. When heaven and earth unite, then the myriad creatures are born. When yin and yang interact, then changes and transformations arise. When human nature and deliberate effort unite, then all under heaven becomes ordered. The reference here to yin and yang as two principles that unite in order to produce, or perhaps better, reproduce, relates to the fact that yin and yang were often connected to the female-male and inside-outside binaries. We will get into the contrast between yin and yang more deeply in future episodes. For now, the thing to appreciate is that already here, in early Confucian texts, the two genders were being conceived as complementary, not just in terms of subordination. This should give encouragement to those who, in more recent times, have tried to articulate a more egalitarian, even feminist Confucian account of gender. We might compare this to the efforts to locate democratic elements in Confucian political thought, as we discussed in the interview with Suo Hun Tan. Similarly, we mentioned in episode 9 how Rosemont and Ames admitted that their role ethics approach, while being inspired by classical Confucianism, would need to redefine gender difference so as to recognize a complementary and productive parity between man and woman. This is a historically justified move, because complementarity was already present in the very beginning of Confucian thought on gender, even if parity was not. Another approach for reforming Confucian attitudes would focus on one of the other 5 relationships named by Mengzi, namely friendship. As Kongzi himself emphasized, friends should ideally be equal to one another. So, if we think that husbands and wives should be friends, which seems plausible enough, then an ideal marriage would be characterized by equality rather than hierarchy. None of this, of course, means that classical Confucianism was as friendly to women as the ideal husband and wife would be to one another. Rather, it means that Confucianism has within it resources for constructing a more appealing conception of gender. Remember that, as a tradition that has been living and evolving ever since it first emerged, Confucianism is not a fixed set of doctrines. This is something we can observe just in the Warring States period. Mengzi and Xunzi may have seen themselves as followers of Kongzi, who was himself following the great sages of the past, but they did not even agree with each other on many points, never mind with the many great Confucians who were to come in the future. With that, we've just about completed our coverage of the first major school of thought in Warring States philosophy, with 3 others still to come. We'll be tackling the Moists, the Taoists, and the Legalists in that order being something of great interest to the Moists and Legalists, as it happens, less so to the Taoists. But since we were just thinking about the resources that Confucianism offers for ethical thought today, we want to end this mini-series by talking to someone who has thought about this very question, and at great length. We'll be talking to Amy Olberding about how Confucianism has helped her to explore the surprising philosophical significance of such ideas as etiquette and rudeness. So, if you please, join us for that next time here on a podcast that, like a wealthy British landholder, has great manners. The History of Philosophy in China.